going to talk a little bit about how things have changed over time, though, and what things look like today on the ground. So that's a shot of our office at New Center on the boulevard. It's intended to be a storefront, a place people can walk in and talk about what they'd like to achieve in their own neighborhood, their part of the city. We want it to be extremely accessible and easily identifiable, so the design of this was important. It was also a transformation of a space that actually had been used a little bit by LTU, but had since fallen into disrepair. And so even our own intervention here was seen to be some kind of a catalytic push on the boulevard, and now we've seen a coffee shop next door to us and other things. So there's a kind of anecdotal note to the office itself. DFC itself is a large book, as you probably know, a 350-page document launched in the beginning of 2013. But it lays out a very long vision for the city moving forward. It recognizes that we certainly didn't get to where we are today overnight, and we are not going to get out of it overnight either, that these are generational circumstances. These are lifelong issues, and we need to understand that, engage them accordingly. But at the same time, as I say to people, and sometimes we meet, that we have to think beyond ourselves, beyond our time here, certainly, and beyond our own block. We also need to understand that for many folks, that's not satisfying, and that things do need to improve within 5 years and 10 years and so on. And certainly I feel that myself. But ultimately, what we've done is identified a few things that we can begin to move on now that can demonstrate real progress for folks and institutions in the city that will actually lay out the framework for realizing bigger goals and things down the road. So I'm not going to, I think you guys can kind of scan what you see on the screen there. There's some important things that we know we need to do right now to stabilize the city, to improve it over time, and then to ensure that we transform it in the long haul. This is about transformation, inclusive transformation. Over that period of time, though, if you take a look out, a lot of plans will kind of lay out a 20-year time horizon, so we wanted to hit that point. The idea here is that we feel that it's important that we ultimately have a stabilized population. At some level, we say 600 to 800,000. To a certain degree, the number itself doesn't matter. The key thing is that we should want to develop a city in which people want to be, right? That we can retain the residents we have and certainly attract new residents, but we need to also not get hung up on a number that somehow we just got to get above 1 million, right? Or we got to do this. And so often during planning, people talk about it as well. The key thing is we just got to get more people back in Detroit. I'm sorry to tell you that's not the case, because really for every 4 people we have in the city, we've got 1 private sector job. That is incredibly low when compared to national averages. The last thing we need are more people with fewer jobs or more people with extreme environmental or health concerns. We need to improve the city now for us as Detroiters and ensure that that then creates a value proposition for others to come and build off of that. That includes employment, and that includes social programs and a whole host of things. So we want to make sure that we can stabilize population and begin to actually move it forward beyond the next 20-year mark. If it grows, that's great. The good news is we have a lot of areas within the city that folks can go, and they aren't the high vacancy areas, actually. We'll talk a little bit about what that could look like. The key thing is to double the number of jobs that are available in the city. As I noted, the job numbers are incredibly low. They remain quite low, and they remain quite low specifically for Detroiters. We also have to make sure that we have a broader kind of regional cooperation, particularly through a regional transportation system, which is a little bit underway right now, that we can begin to be recognized as a global leader in developing 21st century green infrastructure. And of course, it's an important topic for today. We'll talk a little bit about that. We also want to make sure, though, over the long haul, that we have an enhanced and sustained, broad-based and ongoing civic stewardship network. The idea here is that cities like Detroit often suffer. There's a lack of capacity within the city to move things forward as you begin to lose investment and lose population over time. We have committed residents and businesses that want to rally around something. In many cases, Detroit Future City has been that. We're seeing new things happen in the city. We want to make sure that we can motivate more folks and equip more people to move themselves, their families, and their neighborhoods forward, and we're active in doing that right now too. It's an important moment too to do this. This isn't just just some time, right? This is a moment where we have new governance, right? A capacity within the city that I can tell you I haven't experienced really in the last 10 years. regional cooperation that's emerging, a dynamic economy that's actually forming. The kind of earlier model around large-scale vertical integration in automotive firms is changing, and we're seeing different integration, different degrees of startups and agglomerating economies, particularly in the core of the city, that's providing a degree of resilience that we've not seen before. We're seeing new transportation investment, of course, most notably with M1, but there's other things that are coming with it. We're seeing new innovative infrastructure work and partnerships around that, and also important public land coordination that we could have only dreamed about as we began the project 5 years ago. So some big strategic priorities guide what we do to make sure that we can have an immediate impact on quality of life. As I said, there's some big objectives that lay out over multiple decades, but we need to begin to improve circumstances on the ground now. We need to make sure that we can take initial steps toward long-term fiscal sustainability. And I should point out that these two things are often diametrically opposed to one another. The things that will actually provide greater long-term fiscal sustainability are often the things that don't yield immediate quality of life results. We have to find a way to integrate those things because both have to be satisfied. That's a challenge. We also have to make sure that we can, as we say, pick the low-hanging fruit, right? What are those kind of the minimally capital-intensive and human-intensive projects we can do to change things? How can those begin to stimulate other things in policy and regulation? And of course, we have to be willing to make mistakes. And Lord knows we've made a lot of them, and many people like to point them out to us all the time. But we also have to make sure that we remain bold. So part of this for us is really engaging in policy reform, engaging with folks around active pilot projects, and of course leading and acting. It's just not a time for hand-wringing and for additional talking. It's a time for action, but very thoughtful, inclusive, and deliberate action. It's a photograph here that not many people see, particularly not many people that see outside of Detroit, particularly in international media. The images are, of course, a little bit different. The term ruin porn comes up. This is a shot of one half of our waterfront, of course, as seen from Windsor. But when I give this presentation to other places, I always like to point this out because it's important to see that there are things that are really beginning to turn a corner in Detroit. And as that happens, we're seeing places like our greater downtown, the focus on creative industries and finance and a range of different activities begin to kind of really grow. Tens of thousands of new jobs each quarter, hundreds of millions of dollars of reinvestment, a lot of that being private capital. That private capital is now being married with larger public funding and bigger debt capital sources that are coming to the table. All of those things are great. We want to see that continue to grow, but we have to make sure that as this work grows, that it becomes more equitable than it is today. We cannot have a slipstream effect in the tale of two cities, where things are going on here and they're simply not going on in other places, because as much as this is Detroit, so is this. This is a typical neighborhood that is experiencing high degrees of vacancy. It is by no means a typical neighborhood in Detroit. It's not my neighborhood in Detroit. It may not be yours. But there are many areas that look like this. Across the city, we've got a little over 23 square miles of available vacant land. That's larger than the island of Manhattan. If we think about the impact of this land and what it does to us as a population, as a family, and as a person, some of these things can be debilitating. We have to understand that there's limited opportunity here. There's limited amenities and resources. There's limited ways to just simply live your life. And we have to begin to reassess what this is, though, and look beyond its liability into it becoming a real asset, something that can actually be a differentiating point for Detroit. Patrick highlighted a question earlier about how we begin to reutilize some of this land. We will answer that question in many, many ways in a few minutes. This can be really the key point to Detroit's future, perhaps more so than its greater downtown. What's happening in greater downtown is great, but it's largely conventional. We kind of know that, right? We've read that book many times. We've not read this one. And this is where I think we need to be a little bit more concentrated and deliberate, in our thinking. That's really why Detroit Future City exists, in my opinion, to really synthesize these two worlds. There's more worlds, certainly, but those are the ones that tend to be the kind of poster images that we think of. The work itself lays out a number of plans and diagrams and all that you've probably seen. Each piece in its own right is not terribly innovative, right? I mean, there's about like where people work and where they live, how they get from where they live to where they work. It's really fairly basic things, but things that sometimes we take for granted in a city like Detroit that aren't actually successful. we have to begin to rethink the strategies around those things, not just the tactics, right? How and where we develop new employment matters. How and where we develop new housing and the type of housing matters, right? Those issues need to be all kind of brought together into one central vision for the city, and that's what DFC lays out. That's, of course, what we would advocate for being included in a new master plan of policies for the city as it goes forward. So we'll talk a little bit about how we got here. We got here through a number of different means, a highly inclusive plan, 163,000 interactions during its 3-year planning period, 30,000 conversations, 70,000 survey responses. To Bob's point earlier, the work that we do today, any kind of urban redevelopment work, whether it's a single building or a large-scale strategic plan, requires really intense, inclusive interaction with folks. And the idea is that not only are we sharing something here, right? We're forming a direction together as a, let's say, a technical or design team and as an engagement team and as a city in general, but we're also beginning to equip more people to actually move the work forward beyond the planning period, right? So all these folks that wrap around the circle, these folks are then present and equipped to move the work into implementation. They do so across 5 main points that you can see here. I won't read them for you, but each of them then are undergirded by this engagement platform, right? This allows us to continue to grow and nurture capacity overall and ensure that the things that we lay out right now can be fulfilled through a number of different folks, right? That they become the vehicle for this. This isn't about creating multi-million-dollar intensive planning contracts out ad absurdum. This is about making sure that things can change over time. The planning process was something like this. I'll go through this fast. Blue stuff, planning, orange and yellow stuff is implementation. The point in there, without you knowing all the intricacies in it, is that it wasn't like, you know, we started and then we ended. This was a bumpy road, as you might imagine, probably as it should be anytime you're trying to do this kind of work in a large U.S. city. And I can tell you it's prototypical. There's a lot of other cities that are looking to the work that we did, try to understand how they take it on. And I think it is beginning to bear some real fruit for us 2 years into implementation. So we'll talk a little bit about how we do that. And I'm going to set it up really through the lens of about 4 of our main planning priorities that were laid out there. And we'll start with economic growth because in our opinion, it is really, you know, it's probably the most important one. It may be the least directly accessible to a lot of what we think about as architects and planners and designers and landscape architects, but it is absolutely at the core of what the city needs and what it needs for long-term stability. So as I mentioned earlier, 4 people for every 1 private sector job. Number's tipping a little bit right now, but it's not changing by much. And by the way, the wages that are drawn in on that sometimes are extremely low. So you can do the math and figure out what that means. Ultimately, though, when we think about the layout of Detroit and we think about how things are working and the limited income that many folks have, the limited access to mobility, and the fact that 70% of the jobs that are within the city go to folks that live outside the city, right? And think of the CBD and the folks that actually come in. We also have to understand that a little over 60% of Detroiters who are working, and by the way, only 50% of our working age between 18 and 64 are part of the active labor force. 50. That's extremely low. And we will not be able to do anything with any of the rest of the stuff I show you if we don't change that. And so we have to focus there. But if 60% of those folks then are working outside the city, and we know that many folks in the city don't have access to a private vehicle, right? We're really limiting opportunity. We're limiting opportunity for a host of things, particularly the city's ability to stabilize over time. So equity at every stretch matters here. We also have to make sure that as we're beginning to stimulate new entrepreneurial activity, we're thinking about that in a much more inclusive way. I can tell you, when we look at this information down here, what it's basically telling us is in a city that's 83% African American, only 15% of the firms with employees, that's beyond the sole proprietor, are actually owned by African Americans. That disparity is huge, and we've got to close that gap. The other thing that's not on here, and it won't be in the other slides, that I can tell you, some of our recent research shows that Detroit actually ranks second highest for entrepreneurial translation from single-person startup into some degree of activity where you've got multiple employees and you're renting space and all that kind of stuff. Second, nationally, for whites. And it's out of the top 50 markets. And it's markets within cities, it's not a region, right? For African Americans, we're 47th. So we have to begin to actually close that gap. Now I can tell you, as we have a knee-jerk response to that stat, that we also understand that the entrepreneurial activity between communities is different, right? And so in many cases, when we look at the map, Detroit lights up with tons of entrepreneurial activity. We also have to understand that in many cases, a seamstress and a hairdresser and those things are not really intended to translate into multiple employees, translate into paying taxes. We want that, but in many cases, those are things that remain in the basement, and that's okay. But those things that can move on, we want them to blossom. We need people to hire people. We need people to rent equipment and rent space. And so when we think about employing more Detroiters, we think about that, that one idea of the entrepreneurial activity, but we certainly think about many more. We think not only about what's going on in our greater downtown, but we think about other facets of employment that we've seemed to have forgotten over time in Detroit. We have been an industrial town, we are an industrial town, and we will be an industrial town. It's just that industry is changing. It's becoming increasingly innovative, right? Floor area requirements and access to certain infrastructure are shifting. Where rail had been key at one point, now electronic communication and transmission may be more important. So those things shift, but nonetheless, we have globally significant assets in place today that really no other city has on par. And if you think about deep water ports and global logistics in Southwest, you think about concentration of automotive activity just to our south right now here, or the fact that we have an Eds and Meds corridor floating out in our west side that we've seemed to have forgotten about for about 30 years, right? That includes University of Detroit Mercy, Marygrove, it includes Wayne County Community College District, really key in workforce development and translating some of these things into bigger jobs, and we have Sinai Grace Hospital. All of these things can begin to work together to yield a lot more jobs, and we can do that in much more intensive ways on the ground than we are now. The utilization rate for land in our employment districts is extremely low, and we've got to do better with this. These are also sites that have really robust and expensive systems to support. We've got to make sure we're running a lot more revenue through these areas that produce a lot more jobs, and by the way, more jobs that are more accessible to more Detroiters all the time. That's key, right? It's all of this. It's not one or some part of it, and it's not. The thing I'm getting really frustrated with is not this against all of that or vice versa. It's all of this together. And if we can work better together, we're actually going to see some really big results. Some of the things we've done have been contributing to efforts like Goldman Sachs' 10,000 Small Businesses program. While we were the 16th city out of 16 to get Goldman Sachs here, which was a little bit later than we would have hoped, we were happy to get them here because what they do is they provide important job training up front. They provide front office support and back office technical knowledge. They help people translate their entrepreneurial activity, often cases folks that were African American, into some kind of product that's marketable and sellable. And in this case, the work that we're seeing come out is actually having a manifold response, and other folks are starting up their own initiatives and so forth. And this is moving through its third cohort right now. When we think, though, about that kind of activity, and that's kind of indicative of some of the programs that we contribute to, we at DFC tend to think a lot about space, right, and about the land and how we use things. So back to these areas, these are the industrial sites across the city of Detroit. We have relatively okay utilization rates, although the land area, as I said, is a little bit, we're not doing so good there. But what we want to make sure is that we're promoting key areas in the city for employment that we've not really promoted in the past, right? You hear a lot about Midtown, and it's fantastic. Again, it's not something against Midtown at all, but we want to be really bullish on places like the Mount Elliott Employment District, right? It's very sexy, of course, but the idea is that these areas actually have characteristics to them that put them out ahead of many other cities, right? Access to an airport, access to major manufacturing sites, and a whole tier of different product cycles along them, rail infrastructure, so forth. And so we've done this across most of the employment districts, and actually helped to develop this with the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation and launched it last fall. Part of the consideration here also is realizing that Detroit's history, its legacy is tied to industry, as I mentioned. And in some cases, the buildings that were once industrial buildings in the city lie fallow. They're falling apart in many cases. They're part of our history, but they can also be part of our future. And we've begun to do some deeper research in this and how we might reutilize these spaces. I think Bob had mentioned earlier also, demolition and filling up more landfills is not our objective. Our objective is actually to reutilize some of these buildings that are iconic for Detroit and actually have incredibly robust structures. They're sitting on top of robust systems. They are connected to robust infrastructure. We need to leverage them. And so we start to look at that in ways that may be less conventional than what other folks have looked at, but nonetheless feasible. And we understand that these areas don't just stand alone. They're next to people. They're next to where people live and where their kids live. And so for us, it's led to a larger research initiative with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where we've looked more closely at overall industrial land use in the city, recognizing that we have 6.1 square miles of unused industrial sites. It's pretty massive. And within that, we also know that in the floor area, we're looking at about 4.3 square miles of industrial floor area that's unutilized, right? Let's clip 50% of it off that's no longer usable. It's still huge, and we can do a lot with it. And these areas are situated in a much more intimate relationship to neighborhoods than any part of our CBD, right? So what's the new future for industrial sites when we've lost 90% of our industrial workforce overseas? What do these sites become? You don't throw them away, but you begin to reutilize them in some ways. And so we've started to contemplate what some of that might look like. We ran a program 2 months ago, bringing in a lot of folks internationally and what the work that they've done to understand how we might think a little bit differently here. The slide on the right shows some of the large vacant areas. Part of what we've done also has connected to design competitions as a way to really begin to drive innovative thinking and design. This was a competition we ran with Parallel Projections out of New York, looking at the Packard plant and its reutilization. And we've had 200 submissions from 30 countries, some really incredible ideas dealing with renewable energy production, green infrastructure, new employment opportunities, and recreation. And many of them certainly were these kind of moonshot ideas that are unrealizable, but they do change the way you think about things. And within them, also, there were some that were highly practical and things that we're actually promoting in different ways. Some of them began to engage the neighborhood, the community surrounding it in different ways, recognizing that what had been there may not be what will be there in the future, but that nonetheless these places are valuable. And to think really big and bullish about what could happen here, right? So this is this crazy driving gallery for automotive history in the city. The point is not to have too much trepidation about what we do. We took tons of hits for this, right? People came to our gallery space and saw this and said, what the hell are you promoting here, right? We said, we're promoting ideas, and we shouldn't be afraid of them. It doesn't mean you act on this, it just means you think about it, right? We've got to do that, and particularly for us in the room as designers, we can't back away from this stuff. We've got to think a little bit differently about what things might look like in the future. This is a shot in our office when we're showing the work. Part of this then has led back to the GMF work. This is Fernando Palazuelo, the new owner of the Packard plant, and our team of international folks that were in town. We were talking with them about the building and what they're doing. There were some Albert Kahn folks that were on site there. We think it's really important also to think about the adaptive reuse of these types of buildings because of their importance, historically for Detroit. Think about Arsenal of Democracy, the $5 day. These are really important facets to U.S. history that Detroit has contributed to, and many other cities have similar things, right? This is the Fiat factory in Turin, the Lagotto building with the crazy test track on the roof. I mean, this is who in here as an architect didn't study this relatively hardcore at some point in your undergrad. That building was then transformed by Renzo Piano in about 20 years of really hard head-hitting work, transformed it into a multi-use facility for Torino. Now it's the site of cinema, university programs, concert hall, a whole range of things. We can begin to think a little bit more dynamically about this. We're also looking in our research project at places in Amsterdam, particularly De Kooivel. This is where tons of contaminated sites exist along the canals. There's no capital available to immediately remediate them and redevelop them, but what we can do and what they are doing in the near term then is beginning to use phyto remediation, in some cases dendro remediation, to begin to clean up the soils, but then exist on top of it and raise platforms to actually conduct more research and to employ folks and to create destinations for where people want to be to actually recreate. And as you do it, there can actually be some really interesting design opportunities here. They ended up floating barges in and putting them on land to keep folks separated from the ground. So the idea is, even if you don't have the capital to begin to transform some of these things, we can think innovatively about what we do in the interim before you realize a full Lingoto 25-year plan, right? This is a site, it's a destination now. We've also been talking with Dimitri Hegemann of Kraftwerk in Berlin. A lot of folks have heard about this. This is the Detroit-Berlin connection. He sees a way in translating what he's done in Berlin, which is basically exporting, or for them, importing Detroit techno in the late 80s and into the 90s into Berlin factories to create clubs. And now he's taking the idea back to Detroit and trying to land it on the ground here. And so we're working with him on that. He's completely fascinated, as are many people, with Fisher Body 21. He's looking at that facility. He's also looking at different ways to reutilize these buildings over time, right? Well, how do you turn the corner? Huge costs. How do you do these step by step? You know, is there a way that we can begin to change processes here? So this is the shot of the inside of the old power plant that they converted in Berlin. That's what it is today. Dramatic space for arts and performance. It also has some other major employment components to it. The jobs that you can yield off of these sites are quite large, and we're always thinking about that. And by the way, you're also doing some significant remediation throughout the process. It gets us to land use overall. 20 square miles is what we show here. 23.4 today is the square miles of total vacant land. 60% decline in population. And while we have all of this available vacant land, we rank as the lowest amongst the top 20 cities for available recreational space per population. We have also some dramatic health problems, which I'll talk to you about in a second. Not only that, we actually don't have real good density here. So we've got all of this vacant land. We're kind of sprinkled across it. We were already a single-family residential city overhaul, right? So even at our peak population of 1.85 million, we were still relatively low density. But now what we have is all these areas of vacancy, and our core areas, you probably can't read this. I know this is kind of back under this thing, but what this is basically saying here is that when we compare to other cities that are similar, and what we've picked out here is Denver, Atlanta, and Portland. In many cases, the overall density across the entire city, Detroit is denser. You know, land area, people over land area, right? But if you look at the core areas, the areas of highest density, we rank lowest by a considerable amount. 6% of Detroit's land area shows 30 people per acre or greater, when compared to 19% in Denver, 17% in Atlanta, and 13% in Portland. Certainly, other people in the past have highlighted the fact that, hey guys, you know, we even had people in our team going out telling people like, you know, this is like it was like a feel-good slide. It's like, don't worry, you know, we're actually denser than Atlanta, you know, overall. That's not the message. The message is we don't have the core areas that generate the revenue and then support the cost of running an entire city. That's how cities work. And until you get that critical density over a larger land area, you can't turn the corner. And so as much as we talk about open space and vacant land reutilization, and certainly I will talk about it more, we have to build up more density in our urban core. And certainly we have to make sure that that is inclusive as we do it. So I flip from that to open space because as a kind of premier objective of ours in the land use side, because we can't have it, you can't have it one way or the other. Both to go together. Because if you can't begin to establish an open space network, right, which is rationalizing the available vacant area, you continue to kind of peter out development, diminish markets, and underutilize those areas in which you have to be much denser in your development. So this is really about allowing uses we've not seen in the past. This is the undergirding framework map for Detroit Future City, highly evidence-based, a lot of data in here, moving way beyond all the kind of passion plans we've seen in the past, or vision plans, like what we like to call them, right? Where it's about people either in the business elite laying down a claim, or people in the community screaming. Those two motivations create plans that don't serve us well. I worked on many of them. Ultimately, this begins to look at existing vacancy, future vacancy, demographic trends, a whole host of revenue and cost factors to understand where the city's going and what we can do in the future, to know where we have 70% average land vacancy and where we have 10, right? Where we have residential costs that are 3 times the national average and where they're half. we also know that Detroit's existing land use profile doesn't match any of that. It is still dominated by the color yellow, which is, of course, single-family residential for Detroit. Massive amounts of our city are dedicated to this. And by the way, much of it is vacant. Not most, but much of it is. And it's not doing us a really good service, and it's certainly not a terribly long-term sustainable strategy for land utilization in the city. We think that over time there's a way to rationalize this, right? Everyone in the city is going to have, wherever you live today, even in the highest vacancy area, there's no one's being dislocated or relocated anywhere. But the idea is that over time we have to begin to include new uses that we've not contemplated in the past. Because in many cases, in neighborhoods that have high degrees of vacancy, here you average over 70% land vacancy overall. Land vacancy. That means there's no structure on it. You add structures to it, you're probably around 90, 92%. That's, that's through the roof. These are also areas where in the past really passionate people have worked together with their congregations to draw in dollars and to buy 3 parcels from the city of Detroit because they knew the city wanted to get them off their books. And they developed 3 homes on them that were then firebombed 3 weeks later, right? I'm painting an exaggerated picture for you, but the point is we try very hard to focus on the bright, shiny objects of demise in Detroit, but what we need to be focusing on in there is a different strategy, right? It's not about conventional delivery of housing. It's about improving circumstances on the ground. It's about guiding investment across the city in key areas to stabilize them. It's about commercial corridors that actually provide us what we need. And it's about making sure that we have the places we need to go to actually get employment. And as we begin to reconsider the future of land use, we can create, again, a global leader here, and we'll talk a little bit about it. This is a breakdown where people live and work, open space areas, in industrial spaces, again, where folks work with a higher density of employment, hopefully. Breakdown of the different typologies in here. It's really just a wallpaper slide. Just rest assured there's a bunch of very form-based kind of examples of what we can do here. We try to blend Euclidean and form-based zoning in this. These are recommendations that we, of course, provide to the city. Now, to take that a point forward, though, it's important to note also from a city systems perspective that today we operate with about 60% decline in total revenues for the public side systems we operate from the peak. The city is 100% the size it's ever been. And in many cases, these areas that have 70% land vacancy, all the systems are still present. All the water, all the power, right? All the sewer, and by the way, all the police runs and all the ambulance runs and all the fire runs, they're all there. And so how do you begin to actually address those costs, right? There's structural issues, there's union contracts, there's federal guidelines for response time on a fire, and we've worked through many of those things with the City of Detroit to understand how you can begin to reutilize open space while mitigating some of those other factors. They're complex, certainly, but they can be solved, and we can begin to incorporate new green or blue systems to take care of a lot of the issues that we experience today, and I think Bob started to highlight some of them. There's a whole host of major health factors that we experience in Detroit, 72 Superfund sites, huge air quality problems, 3 times the rate of childhood asthma in the city of Detroit compared to the national average. That's actually a little bit larger than some other urban areas. Death rates to heart disease that are high, really high obesity rates. These are huge challenges, and they are going to be generational for a time, and we've got to begin to work through them. We think renewing the system strategically and innovative can help us. That means understanding where we need to double and triple down in investment in big infrastructure systems that can support job growth. It means thinking differently about how you provide systems in other areas. Many people said, yeah, that's where you're going to turn off my power, turn off my water in the Peach area, right? And we get that in meetings. That's not what happens here. This is where you begin to think differently about how you provide a service. This is an area where there is one person, often in areas, right, folks that are living here, let's think about this. These are folks of color. These are folks who are older. These are often women. These are people who are not part of the active labor force, whose quality of life is incredibly compromised. Ultimately, these are folks who may need to go to the store or go to the doctor 2, 3 times a month. The City of Detroit will drive a large unibody bus down that street 5 times a day at a huge cost with very little fare box return. That leads you to bankruptcy. That's where we've been. We think going forward, there's a different way to provide that service. You don't not provide it. You provide it on an on-call service, right? They may be brokered through the local church that now gets a certificate so they can actually pay the insurance, the extra insurance they cover to do that. It's an on-call paratransit system. They do it all over the world. We should be able to do it in Detroit and provide a higher degree of service at a lower cost. At the same time, we look at our fixed gray infrastructure system. Bob started to note this earlier. We have tremendous costs here, across the board, legacy costs, existing systems, and we can't afford them. And in many cases, we're causing some real harm here. So we think about stormwater management, we think about our combined sewer overflow system, which is true of many cities of Detroit's vintage. We ultimately, take all the sanitary waste from this building, combine it with the stormwater waste outside, something you all know very, very well. And when we have a little bit over, this is something you may not know, we have a little over half an inch of rain in Detroit, particularly half an inch over an hour or less. We overwhelm our CSOs, and we typically do direct discharges across all of the discharge points. So all of that human waste doesn't get treated, goes right out into the river. So here's the deal. We live at the center of 84% of the U.S. freshwater supply, 22% of the global surface freshwater supply. We simply have to do better than this, right? This is a globally significant asset. And in many cases, someone would argue that Detroit is the least equipped city to deal with the most precious asset. But we have to step up to that. And we can do it in ways that aren't that incredibly capital intensive. We can use our land, the thing that we have so much of that we wring our hands about, how the hell do we do anything with this land? We know we can actually help to mitigate our stormwater discharge. And at the same time, we can save a ton of money, right? As we do it, we can also begin to incorporate new types of uses that actually grow food and grow energy, right? And as we do this across the city, we can do it in all areas. This isn't just dedicated to one part of the city. It becomes part of this larger open space network that I showed you earlier. This is the kind of layout of it where we can grow food, we can have renewable energy production. We feel, in some of the calculations we've looked at, and there's other folks with Keep Growing Detroit, that we can be a true food secure or food sovereign city by 2050 if we can translate some parts of this land into food production. And certainly if you go to vertical farming in some of the pre-existing vacant industrial structures, we can become a huge exporter of food. Right? This isn't something to shake our heads about and to think that this is returning to a time in our history that we didn't want to go back to, or particularly issues that we have demographically about agricultural production. This is about our city's future and about actually leading other cities globally. We think it's really important. And by the way, when we do this, we might be able to crack off a little bit of land for recreation, land that we don't have a whole lot of. And as we do it also, then we of course be allowing greater densities to be achieved in other areas. This is one of our major projects right now. It's a $2 million green infrastructure initiative on the Lower East Side. We partnered with the Southeastern Michigan Council of Government, SEMCOG, to draw down $1 million from the EPA. We matched that with $1 million locally from Kresge and from URB to implement this. If you think about it, right, $2 million compared to, to a lot of other investments that you work with your clients on, this is not a ton of money, and it's actually going to have a huge, huge impact in 2 different areas in the city. We can do more of this over time. Some of the treatments are being installed right now, particularly in the Lower East Side, and we're going to see some of the metrics start to come out later this fall on stormwater management. Part of this is also tied to the Recovery Park project, which is lagging behind a little bit, but we'll see more there too. We're also trying to make sure that this can translate into other things though, right? So we're working with DWSD in understanding how we can get away from this onerous drainage fee that major commercial landowners hold, right? That ultimately dissuades people from investing in Detroit, but also doesn't really accommodate innovative solutions. You could come in and you could have a great idea, you could have a really powerful LEED idea, and it's not going to save you much with the city, right? And these are extremely expensive fees. We think that over time, though, DWSD is in a position to actually provide incentives, provide a real reason for people to invest in these systems, to set aside that drainage charge, and to utilize spaces on site to manage stormwater. Again, we have the land for this. And we're actually, by the way, we're actually proving this out in an area down on Jefferson, right? So if you think about it from a hydrology perspective, this is your worst case situation. You're very close to the water here. We're actually finding ways to do this through direct conveyance. We're also working extensively with different groups on renewable energy production. Part of this includes coordination with the U.S. Department of Energy and particularly some of the major research labs to understand how we can deploy renewable energy in Detroit. Part of this has been focused on photovoltaic production in different areas. Some of it's also tied to pumped hydro, so that when we generate the power out of the PV, we pump it up to a higher elevation and bring it back down when we need the power, particularly when it's not sunny. This is actually the most efficient way to store energy. Imagine that, water at elevation, and let it just kind of come back down through micro turbines, and you can generate a ton of energy out of it. We're piloting a few efforts for this across the city right now. There's some early things, some things that are partnered with the Michigan National Guard. Hopefully we'll be able to release some of that soon. We're also seeing with folks like Diane Van Buren on the east side in her Beltline Solar District, this is a really important investment there. A strip of that former industrial land situated right on the east side, providing probably about 5 megawatts of power to the surrounding community. We're also looking at carbon buffering programs across industrial sites and roadways. We get a lot of fugitive dust in the city, which leads to a lot of our asthma issues. We've actually been part of some planting programs with greening and others to put this in. Again, these aren't very capital intensive things, but they're also extremely human intensive in some ways when we do it on a shoestring like this. But sometimes that's the way to do it. When we look at issues across neighborhoods, we also have to understand though that the realities that we face here are things that we can begin to address. There's major health problems, there's major issues, $1.5 billion worth of retail leakage every year in Detroit. That's a huge number. And what we found actually is that, so for folks that are trying to find something, right, they need a retail amenity or something in their neighborhood, and I brought up the example earlier in a high vacancy area, often you can't find them. And what we're seeing is these are tracked on a dollar spend basis. It's not a transaction basis. And what we're finding is the areas with the least means have the highest spend rates outside of the city. Often those people don't have a car. So these are folks with the fewest dollars, no transportation, usually deeper down in the city, Lower East Side and Midwest Side. They're finding their way out to the suburbs and they're spending their money out there. This is a huge quadruple loss, right? I mean, this is bad. We have to begin to understand how we can provide these amenities within the city, but not do it in a way you can't support it. Do it in a way you can support it over the long haul, and then it has a bigger effect on the entire city. So this is about improving quality of life. It's about thinking differently about how we do things like remove blight. Yes, we're really excited to see so many homes coming down in the city that are huge blighting influences in their neighborhood, that are huge human safety issues, right? But we think there's different ways to do it. This includes deconstruction. We piloted a deconstruction project in Springwells a year and a half ago to study how you do this over time. 10 different homes, 5 techniques, 2 homes each, to understand both the financial impacts, the timelines for contractors, and the environmental outputs on this, to understand what kind of stuff is coming off and what are the best ways to begin to mitigate things like asbestos and lead distribution. Spoiler alert on that, it's water, it's a hose. You just spray the house. And still contractors struggle to figure that one out. And when you light up a lead poisoning map in Detroit, not only can you not find a house really that doesn't have a red dot on it, you can't find a house that has a red dot with a number that's less than 2. These are the numbers of children who've been reported to have lead poisoning in that home since 1980. That is bad. And so as we eliminate blight in the city and we do demolitions, we sure as shit better do it better than what we've done so far, because we will be creating some real problems for ourselves down the road. It's just not what you want to do. Thank you, Bob. We think that over the long haul, there are ways to marry all these things together, right? So that as you take vacant lots like this and convert them into sites that actually provide places for neighborhoods to go, community art spaces, that we can also begin to incorporate new uses that neighbors actually like and want to put in their gardens and so forth. We're developing a vacant land transformation guide right now. It'll be launched at the end of July and early August. Includes gardens, meadows, prairies, treed areas, a whole host of areas, different things you can do, all driven from the resident perspective. It'll have 35 overall treatments, a way to begin to rethink how you use that land. And overall, we also continue to work with a number of partners like Challenge Detroit to do neighborhood projects and efforts to begin to stabilize other areas. These slides are a little small, I apologize for that, but I'll zip through these quickly. The bottom line is that we're engaged in a number of things. This is EcoD in the Hope Village project. Focus Hope is working on a LEED Platinum building, a home renovation in the Hope Village neighborhood. It's pretty dramatic. We're part of that as well. We think there's a really good way to begin to adaptively reutilize some of these homes for better energy performance and power production. And as we do it, again, it's really critical that we continue to strengthen civic capacity. This is going to be my last slide. And we do that in a number of ways, but I think for me, one of the most meaningful ways is in the work that we do with different schools. A program we've been running now for 2 years with Denby High School has been working with their juniors to develop thesis papers and then provide oral defenses to these papers. So we think about some of the really long-term structural challenges we have in DPS. The ability for us to work with kids like this in Denby, which is an EAA school, right? And to begin to actually have kids develop these papers and then provide an oral defense, this is huge. And I have to tell you, for most of us on our team, some of the really most meaningful and personally impactful work that we can do, because these kids are going to be running our city, right, in a short time, and this is an opportunity to invest in that future. So I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of what we're doing. Thank you.